The wind has no memory. It sweeps across the Iranian plateau tonight the same way it swept 3,000 years ago. Cold, indifferent, carrying the smell of dry earth and something older than language. Stand at Persepolis at dusk, when the last tourists have gone and the guards have retreated to their small fires, and you will feel it. The columns rise around you like the fingers of a buried giant, carved with the faces of 30 nations, bringing tribute to a king who called himself the King of Kings. The stone is warm from the day's sun. The carvings are still sharp, and the silence is so complete that you can almost hear them, the footsteps of an empire that once stretched from the shores of Libya to the banks of the Indus River, an empire so vast that its western edge was waking up for breakfast while its eastern edge was going to sleep. Almost hear them. But not quite, because empires die, and the ones that built this place have been dust for 2,300 years. But here's the thing that history keeps trying to tell us. The thing that gets buried under the noise of wars and dynasties and revolutions. Iran is not a story about an empire that died. Iran is a story about something that refused to die. Again and again and again. Under Greek boots, under Arab swords, under Mongol hooves, under the weight of Cold War politics and oil embargoes and international sanctions, something on this plateau kept breathing. Kept writing poetry, kept speaking the same language, kept lighting fires. 5,000 years. That is not a history. That is a heartbeat. And tonight, we are going to follow it from the first farmers who planted grain on this plateau before the pyramids were a dream, all the way to the supreme leader who sits in Tehran right now, wielding power over 80 million people and nuclear centrifuges and one of the most complicated geopolitical situations on Earth. We are going to move fast. We are going to cover 5 millennia in 1 hour. And along the way, we are going to discover something that most history textbooks bury in footnotes, that the civilization sitting at the center of today's news cycle, the country that the West calls a rogue state, the country that calls itself the Islamic Republic of Iran, is the direct descendant of the oldest continuous civilization in human history. A civilization that invented the concept of human rights before Greece invented democracy. A civilization that built roads across continents while Rome was still a collection of mud huts on seven hills. A civilization that was conquered by everyone and absorbed them all. This is the story of Iran, 5,000 years ago. And it starts with wine. 45,000 years ago, before any of the civilizations we learned about in school, before Mesopotamia, before Egypt, before the first brick was laid in the first city, there were people on the Iranian plateau. We know this from cave paintings, from stone tools, from the traces of campfires in mountain caves near the Caspian Sea. They were hunters. They followed animals across grassland that is now desert. They did not know they were living in what would become one of the most contested pieces of real estate in human history. But they were here first. By 8,000 years before the Common Era, something fundamental had shifted. The nomads had stopped moving. Along the river valleys where mountain meets plain, small villages began to take root. Clusters of mud brick houses, grain storage pits, the bones of domesticated goats and sheep. The Iranian plateau was not, as many people imagine, a land of perpetual desert. It was a land of microclimates, of snow-capped mountains and fertile valleys, of rivers that ran cold and clean from peaks that stayed white year-round. It was, in the right places, astonishingly generous. And in one of those right places, a site archaeologists would later call Haji Firuz Tepe, in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains in northwestern Iran, someone made wine. We know this because the residue is still there. Inside a clay jar excavated in the 1960s, sealed with a resin stopper and buried in the corner of the kitchen floor, chemists found tartaric acid, the unmistakable fingerprint of fermented grapes. The jar dates to approximately 5,400 BCE. It is the oldest confirmed wine vessel ever found, 7,000 years old. Older than the wheel, older than writing, older than almost everything we think of as civilization. Someone on this plateau looked at grapes and thought, I wonder what happens if I wait. That impulse, the willingness to transform raw material through patience and intelligence, would define this land for the next 50 centuries. By 3000 BCE, the civilization that historians call the Elamites had risen in what is now southwestern Iran. Their capital was Susa, a city that would be continuously inhabited for longer than almost any other city on Earth. The Elamites developed their own writing system, adapted from Mesopotamian cuneiform but distinct, unmistakably their own. They built temples, they traded, they fought, they produced artwork of extraordinary delicacy, bronze figures, painted pottery, cylinder seals carved with scenes of hunting and worship. They were not a footnote, they were a civilization. And when the Mesopotamian city of Ur fell, in one of history's great early power shifts, it was the Elamites who delivered the final blow. But the Elamites are not the beginning of the story we usually tell about Iran. The beginning of that story, the one that echoes through everything that follows, starts with a group of people called the Medes. The Medes were Iranian-speaking tribes who had settled in the northwestern part of the plateau, in the mountainous regions south of the Caspian Sea. For centuries, they existed as a loose confederation of native peoples who shared language and culture, but rarely unified. The Assyrian Empire, which dominated the Near East in the first millennium BCE with a brutality that made their contemporaries flinch, extracted tribute from the Medes and occasionally raided their villages when they felt like it. The Assyrians were not gentle administrators. They were masters of organized terror. They flayed prisoners alive. They built towers of skulls.
We cannot
they deported
abandon the
entire
southern grazing
populations.
lands, my Khan.
History
It is
records
madness.
their cruelty
The
in
winter
their
there
own
is too harsh
inscriptions,
this year,
written
to
in
the
stone by
abundance of the
scribes who
steppe
apparently had no
and the
idea
glory
how
of
bad
the
this was going
empire.
to look. But the Medes
May the
noticed
spirits
something.
favor us.
The Assyrians had enemies everywhere. Every nation they had crushed nursed its resentment quietly, waiting. Under a king named Cyrus, a man who understood that the right alliance at the right moment could shatter what seemed unshatterable, the Medes joined forces with the Babylonians. In 612 BCE, they descended on Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital, and leveled it. The most powerful empire in the world at that moment ceased to exist in a single military campaign. The prophet Nahum, writing in the Jewish scriptures, described the fall of Nineveh with barely concealed ecstasy. An entire region exhaled. The Median Empire that followed was the first Iranian empire in history. It stretched from what is now Turkey in the west to the edges of Central Asia in the east. It was vast, it was powerful, and it lasted less than a century because something was moving in the south. Something that would dwarf everything that came before it. His name was Cyrus. Cyrus II of the Achaemenid dynasty came from Persis, the region in southern Iran that the Greeks would call Persia, and that gave the whole civilization its Western name. He was, by birth, a vassal king under Median authority. His grandfather had ruled before him under Median overlordship, paying tribute, deferring to the north. This was the order of things. This was how the world worked. Cyrus changed how the world worked. In 550 BCE, he marched against his Median overlord, King Astyages, and won. But here is what made Cyrus different from every conqueror before him. He did not sack the Median capital. He did not enslave the Median population. He absorbed them. He incorporated their nobles into his court, their soldiers into his army, their administrative systems into his expanding structure. He conquered through inclusion. He built an empire the way a river builds its channel, by finding the path of least resistance and making it permanent. Within 20 years, he had taken Lydia, the fabulously wealthy kingdom of King Croesus in western Turkey, whose name had become synonymous with gold. He had taken Babylon, the greatest city in the world, the center of Mesopotamian civilization, the place where the Hanging Gardens reportedly made visitors weep with their beauty. And he walked into Babylon not as a destroyer but as a liberator. The Babylonian priests of Marduk, who had grown to despise their own king, welcomed Cyrus with open arms. He declared that he had been sent by Marduk himself to restore the city's ancient traditions. The cylinder that his scribes produced to commemorate this moment, a barrel-shaped clay tablet inscribed in cuneiform, now housed in the British Museum, contains something that had never appeared in writing before. It contains a declaration of religious freedom, of the right of displaced peoples to return to their homelands, of the obligation of a ruler to care for the welfare of those he governs. We call it the Cyrus Cylinder. Some historians call it the first human rights document in history. He released the Jews from their Babylonian captivity. All of them. He funded the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. The book of Isaiah calls him the Messiah, the Anointed One, not metaphorically, but literally. A Persian king, called the Messiah by Jewish scripture. This is not small. This is world historical. When Cyrus died in 530 BCE, probably in battle on his northeastern frontier, against the nomadic Massageti tribe, he had built an empire that stretched from modern Greece to modern Pakistan. His son Cambyses added Egypt. And then his successor, Darius the Great, organized all of it into something that no empire had ever successfully managed before. A functional, administered, lawful state covering nearly 3 million square miles and 30 distinct nations. Darius divided the empire into 20 provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap, a regional administrator answerable to the king. He built the Royal Road, a paved highway stretching 2,700 kilometers from Sardis on the Aegean coast to Susa in southwestern Iran, along which royal messengers could ride so fast that Herodotus marveled at their speed. He standardized weights and measures. He minted coins. He dug a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea, a predecessor to the Suez Canal 1,000 years early. He built Persepolis. Not as a capital, the Achaemenids had multiple capitals, but as a ceremonial center, a statement in stone about who they were. Every spring, delegations from all 30 provinces would come to Persepolis bearing tribute. The reliefs carved into the staircases still show them: Babylonians with cloth, Indians with gold, Ethiopians with ivory, Greeks with precious vessels. 30 nations, one platform, one king receiving them all. At its height, the Achaemenid Empire contained somewhere between 40 and 50% of the world's population. No empire before or since has ever governed a larger share of humanity. But there was trouble in the West. The Greek city-states refused to submit. Athens and Sparta and their allies fought back at Marathon, at Thermopylae, at Salamis, battles that the Greeks wrote about obsessively and that Western civilization has enshrined as the founding myth of freedom versus tyranny. The Persian Wars are the story that Greece told about itself for centuries. They are not, it should be noted, the story that Persia told. From the Achaemenid perspective, the Greeks were a minor irritant on the western fringe of a vast empire, rebellious tributaries who won a few defensive battles and then spent 200 years congratulating themselves. But the Greek perspective won the war of narratives, and it shaped how the Western world would see Iran for the next 2.5 millennia. The Achaemenid Empire lasted 200 years. It fell not to rebellion from within, not to economic collapse, not to the slow rot of institutional decay. It fell to one man with a specific kind of genius for destruction. His name was Alexander, and he was 25 years old. In 334 BCE, Alexander III of Macedon crossed the Hellespont into Asia with an army of approximately 40,000 men, a force that was, by the standards of the Persian Empire, laughably small. The Achaemenid Empire could field armies 10 times that size. It controlled resources that Macedonia could not imagine. Its navy dominated the eastern Mediterranean. Its cavalry was among the finest in the ancient world. And yet, Alexander met the Persian forces at the Granicus River in northwestern Turkey, crossed under fire, and won. He met them again at Issus in 333 BCE, this time against an army personally led by Darius III, and won again. He swept down the Levantine coast, besieged Tyre for 7 months before taking it, marched into Egypt, where the priests of Amun greeted him as a liberator and declared him the son of their god. He was 23 years old. He had not yet lost a battle. He would not lose one until death. The decisive moment came at Gaugamela in 331 BCE in what is now northern Iraq. Darius had assembled a force that ancient sources put at 1 million men, a number we rightly treat with skepticism, but which even the most conservative modern estimate places at 250,000. Alexander had 47,000. The odds were, on paper, insurmountable. But Darius had a problem that no number of soldiers could solve. He was fighting a man who did not respond to conventional military logic. When Alexander's companion cavalry punched through the Persian left flank and drove directly toward Darius himself, not toward the battlefield objective, not toward the high ground, but directly toward the king, Darius did something that no one has ever fully forgiven him for. He fled. The King of Kings, in his war chariot, turned and ran. His army, seeing its king in retreat, collapsed. Alexander entered Persepolis in January of 330 BCE. What happened next remains one of history's most argued questions. After weeks of occupation, feasting, and the plundering of a treasury so vast that it took 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels to haul it away. Persepolis burned. The ancient sources disagree about whether it was deliberate, the calculated destruction of Achaemenid power, or the drunken aftermath of a party that got out of hand. A Greek courtesan named Thais allegedly held the torch. Alexander allegedly regretted it in the morning. What is certain is that the palace of Xerxes, the throne rooms of Darius, the stone reliefs of 30 nations paying tribute, all of it burned. The columns that still stand at Persepolis today are columns that survived, not the ones that fell. Darius III fled east, trying to reach Central Asia and regroup. He never made it. His own satraps, calculating that a live enemy was more dangerous than a dead surrendered ally, stabbed him and left him dying in a cart on the road to Bactria. Alexander, they say, found him still breathing and covered the body with his own cloak. Whether that gesture was genuine sorrow or political theater, we cannot know. Perhaps both. The Achaemenid Empire was over. But Persia was not. Here is the thing about the Persian culture that Alexander, who admired it, who adopted Persian dress and court customs, who married a Bactrian princess and encouraged his generals to do the same, understood intuitively. It was too old and too deep to be erased by military conquest. The Persian language kept being spoken. The Persian administrative systems kept functioning because they were the best available. Persian nobles kept serving in the courts of their conquerors because they were indispensable. The architecture, the poetry, the spiritual frameworks they continued, quietly, underneath the new Greek surface that Alexander plastered over everything. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, aged 32, his empire immediately fractured along the fault lines he had papered over with personal charisma and military genius. His generals, the Diadochi, the successors, spent decades fighting each other. The Iranian plateau and surrounding regions fell to Seleucus I, a capable but fundamentally Greek ruler who tried to govern a Persian world with Macedonian assumptions. It did not go well. The Seleucids held Iran for roughly 80 years. They founded Greek cities Seleucia on the Tigris, Antioch in Syria, and encouraged Greek immigration. They held grand courts and conducted business in Greek. But the Persian countryside, the Persian peasantry, the Persian nobility, they were not Greek and they did not want to be. The resistance was not always military, it was cultural. It was a quiet, stubborn refusal to forget who you were. In 247 BCE, in the northeastern province of Parthia, roughly modern-day Turkmenistan and northeastern Iran, a tribal leader named Arsaces led a successful revolt against Seleucid authority. It was, at the time, a small event, a regional uprising, the kind of thing that happens at the edges of empires all the time. But it was the beginning of the Parthian Empire, and the Parthian Empire would last nearly 500 years. The Parthians were Iranian. They spoke an Iranian language. They governed in an Iranian tradition, even as they incorporated Hellenistic court elements that had become the regional standard. They pushed the Seleucids steadily westward, taking Mesopotamia by 141 BCE, and found themselves the dominant power from the Euphrates to the Hindu Kush. To their west stood Rome, expanding aggressively through the Middle East. The collision was inevitable. The Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE was Rome's introduction to what Iran could do to an invader who misread the terrain and the enemy. Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Roman history, political partner of Caesar and Pompey, a man who thought a military victory in the east would complete his claim to greatness, led 7 legions into the Syrian desert against a Parthian force that was smaller, faster, and operated on principles Roman generals had never encountered. The Parthian cavalry did not stand and fight, they wheeled and shot. Their horse archers could fire backward at full gallop, the famous Parthian shot releasing arrows over the horse's hindquarters with devastating accuracy. When the Romans formed their defensive testudo, the overlapping shield formation, the Parthians simply waited at the edge of range and shot until the formation broke. Crassus's son rode out with a detachment to relieve the pressure. He was surrounded and killed. His head was brought back on a spear and shown to his father. Crassus himself was captured shortly afterward, trying to negotiate. He was killed, and according to one famous tradition, molten gold was poured into his mouth in a final posthumous commentary on his greed. 20,000 Roman soldiers died. 10,000 were taken prisoner and marched east to the Parthian frontier, where they served as garrison troops for decades. Some historians believe their descendants survived into the Chinese frontier regions, becoming the fabled soldiers of the Roman legion found in China tradition. Rome never conquered Parthia, ever. Multiple emperors tried, none succeeded. But the Parthians were not builders of the grand civilizational projects that had defined the Achaemenids. They were effective rulers, skilled warriors, pragmatic administrators, but they did not produce an Achaemenid-scale cultural flowering. And by the early 3rd century of the Common Era, they had grown exhausted internal dynastic disputes, perpetual Roman pressure from the west, nomadic pressure from the north and east. In 224 CE, a man named Ardashir I, a petty king from the province of Persis, the same region that had produced Cyrus, defeated and killed the last Parthian king in battle. He declared himself the first king of the Sasanian dynasty and announced his intention to restore the glory of the Achaemenids. He meant it. The Sasanian Empire was, by any measure, one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. It lasted 400 years. At its peak, it governed a territory stretching from the borders of modern Pakistan and Afghanistan in the east through Iraq and the Caucasus in the west, with a southern border touching the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. Its capital, Ctesiphon, located near modern Baghdad, was one of the largest cities on earth. Its administrative systems were sophisticated. Its art, its architecture, its philosophy were extraordinary. Its state religion, Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian faith that taught a cosmic struggle between light and darkness, between truth and the lie, shaped the spiritual landscape of the entire region. And its military was formidable enough to do something no other power in the ancient world had managed. In 260 CE, at the Battle of Edessa in southeastern Turkey, the Sasanian king Shapur I defeated and captured the Roman Emperor Valerian. The Roman Emperor. In battle. This was not something that was supposed to happen. Rome had been defeated before Hannibal had done it at Cannae, the Parthians had done it at Carrhae, but Roman emperors did not get taken prisoner. They died in battle, they were assassinated by their own guards, they retired but they did not get captured. Shapur commemorated this moment in a series of rock reliefs carved into cliffsides across Iran. At Nakshi Rostam, near Persepolis, you can still see it. Valerian kneeling before the mounted figure of Shapur, his hands extended in submission. The Roman emperor, on his knees. In stone. For eternity. It was the zenith of Sasanian power. But the defining feature of Sasanian history was not triumph, it was exhaustion. For over 300 years, the Sasanians and the Byzantines, the eastern continuation of the Roman Empire, fought each other in a grinding, generation-consuming, economically devastating series of wars. Both empires won battles. Both empires lost battles. Both empires devastated each other's borderlands, taxed their populations to the breaking point, burned cities and crops and infrastructure in cycles that no recovery could fully repair. By the early 7th century, both empires were bleeding. The Sasanians had swept to their greatest territorial expansion under Khosrow II. They took Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and briefly stood at the gates of Constantinople itself. Then they overextended. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius launched a brilliant counter-campaign, driving deep into Sasanian territory, sacking their sacred fire temples, overturning the momentum completely. Khosrow II was overthrown and executed by his own son in 628 CE. In the 12 years that followed, the Sasanians cycled through 10 different rulers. The empire was in free fall, not from an external enemy, but from the weight of its own crises. The treasury was empty. The army was unpaid. The provincial governors were essentially independent warlords. The administrative machinery that had held together one of history's great empires was seizing up like an engine with no oil. And in the Arabian desert to the southwest, something was moving. It had been moving for less than 20 years. Its founder had died just 6 years earlier, a merchant from Mecca who had received what he described as divine revelation and built around it a religious movement of extraordinary intensity and cohesion. The followers of Muhammad were not a state. They were not an empire. They were a community of believers armed with a conviction so total that it translated into military effectiveness that astonished everyone who encountered it. The Arab Muslim armies that crossed into Mesopotamia in 633 CE were not the largest forces ever assembled. They were not the best equipped. They did not have the training of Roman legions or the organizational depth of the Sasanian military. What they had was momentum, the momentum of a people who believed with absolute certainty that God was on their side. And they were fighting an empire that had forgotten, after 4 centuries of bureaucratic accumulation, what it believed in at all. The night before the decisive battle at Qadisiyah in 636 CE, the Sasanian commander, Rustam Farrukhzad, a man who understood the situation clearly enough to know how badly it could go, reportedly could not sleep. The Persian sources are not entirely reliable here. They were written centuries later, filtered through the perspective of defeat and conversion. But the image they preserve is striking. A general lying awake in his tent, listening to the sounds of an army that had lost faith in its own survival, watching the stars through the tent flap and calculating odds that did not add up. His army had elephants. It had armored cavalry of a sophistication the Arabs had never encountered. It had numbers and experience and the accumulated military knowledge of 400 years. It had everything that should have been enough. But it was tired, it was old, and it was fighting people who were not. At Qadisiyah, after 3 days of fighting, the Arab forces broke through the Persian lines. Rustam was killed. The sources say he was caught sheltering beneath a baggage mule and killed by a common soldier named Hilal ibn Ulafa. Whether that specific detail is true matters less than what it represents. The greatest empire in the Iranian world ended by a man whose name history barely bothered to preserve. In 637 CE, the Arab forces took Ctesiphon. The last Sasanian king, Yazdegerd III, fled east, seeking allies who never materialized. In 651 CE, he was murdered in a mill near Merv in Central Asia, killed, the sources say, by the miller who wanted his few remaining possessions. The King of Kings, alone, in a mill, killed for his clothes. An empire of 400 years, over. But here is what history understands, and what the Arab conquerors perhaps did not fully anticipate. You can conquer a people's territory without conquering their soul. Phase 1. The fire that would not die, Arab conquest and Persian survival. The Arab armies swept across the Iranian plateau like a desert wind, fast, hot, relentless. City after city submitted. The Zoroastrian fire temples were converted or destroyed. The Sasanian administrative apparatus was dismantled and replaced with Arab governors, reporting to caliphs in Medina and then Damascus. The Iranian nobility, the Dekhans, the landowners, the educated elite that had staffed the empire's bureaucracy for generations, found themselves suddenly, disorientedly, on the periphery of a new world, and they began to adapt. This is the move that saved Iranian civilization. Not military resistance. The military resistance failed, comprehensively and quickly. Not political independence. There was none. What saved Iran was cultural porousness, the ability to enter the new system from the inside and reshape it from within. Persian nobles converted to Islam genuinely, sincerely, in many cases, and then brought to their new faith everything they already knew: their administrative expertise, their literary traditions, their philosophical frameworks, their understanding of how large, complex systems actually function. The Umayyad Caliphate, which governed the expanding Islamic world from Damascus starting in 661 CE, was fundamentally an Arab project. Arab identity was privileged. Non-Arab Muslims called Mawali, clients occupied a second tier, regardless of their abilities or their contributions. The Persians noticed this. They remembered what they had been, and they organized. The Abbasid Revolution of 750 CE is one of the most consequential political upheavals in Islamic history, and it could not have happened without Iranian participation. The Abbasids, descendants of Muhammad's uncle, rallied support in the eastern provinces, in Khorasan, in precisely the regions where the Iranian Mawali were most numerous and most resentful of Umayyad Arab supremacy. The black banners of the Abbasids swept westward. The Umayyad Caliph Marwan II was defeated, killed, his dynasty extinguished. The new capital was Baghdad, founded in 762 CE by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, and Baghdad, from its very first years, was not an Arab city. It was a Persian city wearing an Arab name. The architects who designed its famous round plan were Persian. The administrators who staffed its government were Persian. The scholars who filled its libraries and translated Greek philosophy into Arabic, the process that would eventually transmit Aristotle and Euclid and Galen back to a Europe that had lost them, were, overwhelmingly, Iranian. The Islamic Golden Age, that extraordinary explosion of mathematical, astronomical, medical, and philosophical achievement between the 8th and 13th centuries, was largely a Persian project. Al-Khwarizmi, who invented algebra and whose name gives us the word algorithm, was from Khwarezm in Central Asia, Iranian-speaking. Ibn Sina, whose canon of medicine was used as a standard text in European medical schools until the 17th century, was from Bukhara, Iranian. Omar Khayyam, who made fundamental contributions to algebra and calendar reform, and who is most remembered in the West for his wine-soaked poetry, was from Nishapur in northeastern Iran. But perhaps the most important act of cultural preservation, the one that guaranteed Iranian identity would survive even total political subjugation, happened not in a court, not in a library, but in the mind of a poet. Abu al-Qasim Ferdowsi was born around 940 CE near Tus in the northeastern Iranian province of Khorasan. He spent approximately 35 years writing a single poem. The Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, is 60,000 couplets long. It recounts the history of Iran from the mythological creation of the world through the Islamic conquest in the 7th century. It is the longest poem ever written by a single author in the history of world literature, and it is written entirely in Persian. This sounds simple. It is not. For nearly 3 centuries after the Arab conquest, Persian Farsi had been retreating. Arabic was the language of religion, of law, of scholarship, of government. Writing in Persian at all was an act of cultural assertion. Writing 60,000 couplets of Persian, preserving the myths and heroes and kings of pre-Islamic Iran in a form that could be memorized and recited across the entire Iranian world, this was not poetry. This was a rescue mission. The heroes of the Shahnameh: Rustam, the warrior; Sohrab, his doomed son; Siavash, the innocent prince; Khosrow, the philosopher king, became the common property of every Persian-speaking person in the world. The poem traveled east to Central Asia, north to the Caucasus, west to Anatolia, south to the Indian subcontinent. Wherever Persian was spoken, the Shahnameh was known. It became the thread connecting Iranian identity across 14 centuries of political upheaval. Ferdowsi, according to legend, presented his completed epic to the Ghaznavid Sultan Mahmud, who had promised generous payment. The Sultan allegedly offered a pittance. Ferdowsi, furious, divided the money among a bathhouse attendant and a beer seller, wrote a blistering satirical preface, and died shortly afterward in obscurity. The Sultan, the story goes, eventually recognized his error and sent proper payment, arriving at the city gates just as Ferdowsi's funeral procession was leaving through them. Whether the story is true or embellished matters less than what it reveals. A poet who believed his work was worth more than a sultan's judgment. In Iranian cultural memory, Ferdowsi is not a tragic figure. He is a victor. The Sultan is dust. The Shahnameh endures. By the 10th and 11th centuries, effectively independent Persian dynasties, the Tahirids, the Safavids, the Sassanids, the Buyids had carved out autonomous power within the nominally unified Islamic world. The language they governed in, the language they wrote poetry in, the language their courts celebrated was Persian. Iranian cultural identity had not just survived Arab political dominance. It had, in the precise words of one modern historian, Persianized Islam from within. And then the sky fell. Phaz 2. The sky falls, the Mongol catastrophe. In 1219 CE, Genghis Khan turned west. The immediate cause was the execution of a Mongol trade delegation by the Khwarezmian Shah, a catastrophic miscalculation by a ruler who did not understand what he had just done. What he had done was give the most effective military machine in human history a personal reason to destroy everything he owned. The Mongols moved through northeastern Iran like a fire through dry grass. Merv, a city of several 100,000 people, one of the great cities of the Islamic world, a center of scholarship and trade that had flourished for centuries, was taken, sacked, and its population methodically killed. Contemporary sources, accounting for obvious exaggeration, still describe a number of dead that modern historians estimate at between 100,000 and several hundred thousand. Nishapur, Ferdowsi's home province, resisted and was taken by storm. The Mongols killed not just the people, but the dogs and cats. Herat, Balkh, Tus, city after city, emptied. The scale is difficult to comprehend. Modern demographic analyses of the Iranian plateau suggest that the population fell somewhere between 50 and 75% in the decades of Mongol conquest. In absolute terms, this may represent the largest proportional population loss of any major civilization in recorded history. Irrigation systems that had watered farmland for millennia were destroyed and not repaired for generations. Cities that had taken centuries to build were reduced to rubble in days. But here is the thing that is almost unbearably strange and yet completely consistent with the pattern of Iranian history. The Mongols, within 2 generations, became Iranian. Hulagu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, who completed the conquest of Iran and in 1258 sacked Baghdad and killed the Abbasid Caliph, ending the institution that had symbolically unified the Islamic world for 5 centuries, established the Ilkhanate in Iran. And the Ilkhanate, within decades, converted to Islam and adopted the Persian language and Persian administrative traditions. The Mongol rulers commissioned Persian language histories, sponsored Persian poetry, built in the Persian architectural tradition. The conquerors became patrons. The survivors became teachers. The Shahnameh Ferdowsi's great poem, the one written to preserve Iranian identity, was printed in mass quantities under Mongol patronage, with spectacular illustrated manuscripts that are today among the most valuable art objects in the world. Iran had been nearly destroyed, and it had absorbed its destroyers. By the mid-14th century, the Ilkhanate had fragmented. A succession of smaller dynasties competed for the Iranian plateau, the Jalayirids, the Muzaffarids, the Kartids. And then, from Central Asia, came one more wave of destruction. Timur the Lame Tamerlane, who swept through Iran in the late 14th century with a ferocity that recalled the original Mongol conquests. He built towers of skulls outside the cities he sacked. He was a Muslim. He sponsored Persian poetry. He destroyed and created simultaneously, the way Iran's history always seemed to work. After Timur, his successors, the Timurids, ruled eastern Iran from their capital at Herat, producing one of the most refined cultural courts in Islamic history. Miniature painting, architecture, philosophy, poetry, the Timurid court was a place of extraordinary artistic achievement, even as the political situation around it remained unstable and violent. And in the west of Iran, in the late 15th century, something was stirring. Something that would transform Iran permanently, something that begins with a 12-year-old boy and a red hat. PHAs 3. The Red Hats, the Safavid Revolution. His name was Ismail. He was 12 years old when he escaped captivity in Gilan on the Caspian coast in 1494. He was the head of a Sufi religious order called the Safaviya, a movement that had been building political and military power in northwestern Iran for generations, drawing its followers from the Turkic tribes of Azerbaijan and Anatolia. His followers wore distinctive red hats with 12 folds, representing the 12 imams of Shia Islam. They were called the Qizilbash, the Redheads. They worshipped Ismail with an intensity that went considerably beyond conventional religious devotion. Some of them believed he was divine. In 1501, Ismail marched into Tabriz at the head of his Qizilbash army. He was 14 years old. He declared himself Shah of Iran, and then he made the announcement that would change the religious and political map of the Middle East permanently, and that still shapes it today. He declared that Twelver Shia Islam was the state religion of Iran. Not a personal preference, not a suggested orientation. The mandatory religion of every Iranian subject, to be enforced with the full power of the state. At that moment, approximately 90% of Iran's population was Sunni Muslim. The Shia tradition, which held that legitimate leadership of the Islamic community belonged to the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad through his cousin Ali, was a minority position in Iran as everywhere else. Ismail set about changing this. Sunni scholars who refused to conform were killed or exiled. Shia clergy from Iraq, Lebanon, and elsewhere were imported and given positions of authority. The population converted some willingly, many under duress, most probably through a combination of social pressure and genuine spiritual persuasion over time. Within a century, Iran was overwhelmingly Shia. This was not a theological adjustment. This was the construction of a separate civilizational identity. In a world where Sunni Ottoman power dominated from Constantinople to Cairo, where Sunni Uzbek power pressed from Central Asia, Shia Iran became a distinct entity, a buffer, a counterweight, an alternative. The Ottoman sultans and the Safavid Shahs fought each other not just for territory but for the soul of the Islamic world. Their wars lasted 150 years. The first of those wars produced an early disaster. In 1514, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I marched against Ismail with a vastly superior force, equipped with artillery that the Safavids did not yet possess. At the Battle of Chaldiran in eastern Anatolia, the Qizilbash cavalry, which had swept everything before it for 15 years, charged into Ottoman cannon fire. The result was catastrophic. The redheads charged, the guns fired, men and horses were torn apart. Ismail himself was nearly captured. Tabriz fell to the Ottomans temporarily. Ismail never recovered psychologically. He withdrew from public life, drank heavily, and died at 37, the boy who had ridden into Tabriz at 14 with a conquering army, now a broken man. But his project survived him. The Safavid state consolidated, reorganized, introduced its own artillery and military reforms, and continued the long grinding conflict with the Ottomans. And under its fifth great ruler, Shah Abbas I, who came to power in 1587 and would rule until 1629, the Safavid Empire reached its apex. Abbas was a political genius and a ruthless one. He reformed the army, reducing his dependence on the fractious Qizilbash tribes by building a professional corps, Georgian and Armenian soldiers. Converted to Islam, trained in modern tactics, paid in cash, and loyal to the Shah personally rather than to tribal identity, he reorganized the bureaucracy. He established diplomatic relations with European powers, England, Spain, Portugal, who were looking for allies against the Ottoman Empire. He moved the capital to Isfahan, in the center of the Iranian plateau, and began building. What he built is still there. The Imam Mosque, now called the Shah Mosque, was completed in 1629, the year Abbas died. Its dome, covered in turquoise and cobalt tilework, is visible from across the city. The tile patterns shift color as the light changes through the day, blue in the morning, green at midday, violet at dusk. The craftsmen who made the tiles were working in a tradition that went back centuries, but under Abbas they achieved something that has never been surpassed. Standing in the central courtyard at dawn, hearing the first call to prayer echo between the four great Iwans, is to understand why the Safavid period called itself the Age of Isfahan and why a common Persian saying declared that Isfahan is half the world. The Great Maidan in front of the mosque, the Naksh-i-Jahan Square, the image of the world, is one of the largest public squares ever built. Around it stood the Ali Kapu Palace, the Sheikh Lotfullah Mosque, and the covered bazaar that connected commercial to ceremonial life in the way that only great urban planning manages. On its grass, polo was played, a game that the Persians had invented and the British would later claim as their own. This was the Golden Age. Silk trade, carpet production, miniature painting, poetry, philosophy all flourished under Safavid patronage. European travelers who came to Isfahan in the 17th century wrote home with something close to awe. One English merchant wrote that he had seen nothing in Europe to compare with it. The French jeweler Jean-Baptiste Tavernier made 6 visits to Persia and wrote extensively about the extraordinary quality of its craftsmanship and the sophistication of its commercial networks. But empires do not remain golden forever. The later Safavid Shahs were by and large diminished figures confined to their harems, controlled by court factions, increasingly detached from the realities of governance. The Qizilbash, whose power Abbas had broken, never fully disappeared. The relationship between the state and the Shia clergy, the ulama, became increasingly complex and occasionally antagonistic. The treasury was strained, the army deteriorated. In 1722, an army of Afghan tribesmen from the eastern province of Kandahar marched into Iran and took Isfahan. The last effective Safavid Shah, Sultan Hussein, after months of siege and famine, walked out of his city and laid his crown at the feet of the Afghan leader Mahmud. Iran's greatest dynasty, the one that had made the country what it still is today, ended not in a final battle, but in an act of submission so complete it has the quality of a nightmare. Phaz 4. The Sword and the Pity Nadir, Qajar, and the Age of Great Game. The vacuum left by the Safavid collapse was filled, briefly and violently, by a man who is one of the most extraordinary and terrifying figures in Iranian history. Nader Shah Afshar was a soldier from a Turkic tribe in northeastern Iran who rose through military service to become the effective ruler of the country by 1732 and its nominal king by 1736. He was a military genius of the first order. Some historians rank him alongside Alexander and Napoleon as a battlefield commander. He drove the Afghans out of Iran. He defeated the Ottomans repeatedly. He drove the Russians from the Caucasus. He invaded India in 1739 at the head of an army that moved faster than any contemporary force and defeated the Mughal emperor at the Battle of Karnal before sacking Delhi with a controlled violence that extracted an almost incomprehensible amount of treasure. The Peacock Throne, the Koh-i-Noor Diamond, the Darya-i-Noor, all of them came back to Iran in Nader's baggage trains. The plunder from India was so immense that Nader suspended taxation in Iran for 3 years. He also had people blinded, including his own son, whom he suspected of conspiracy. He ordered mass atrocities against populations that resisted him. He became, by the end of his reign, a figure of genuine terror, the brilliant general transformed into something darker, something that his own commanders could no longer follow. In June of 1747, in his tent in Khorasan, Nader Shah was assassinated by a group of his own officers. He died as he had lived in violence, surrounded by people who feared him. The empire he had built, which had briefly looked like a new Achaemenid project, dissolved overnight. Iran entered a period of civil war between competing successors. The Qajar dynasty, which finally consolidated power in 1796 under Aga Muhammad Khan, a man who had been castrated as a boy by Nader Shah's successors and who had turned that humiliation into a lifetime of cold, calculating ambition, inherited an Iran that was exhausted, depopulated, and increasingly facing threats that no amount of military brilliance could solve. Because now there was something new on the horizon. Something that the Mongols had not been, and the Arabs had not been, and even Alexander had not been. 2 great industrial powers, both of them far wealthier and far more technologically advanced than anything Iran could match, were expanding toward each other across Central Asia. Between them, Iran was the road. Russia had been pushing south since Peter the Great. Britain had been pushing north from India since the East India Company. The great game, as Rudyard Kipling would eventually name it, with the casual confidence of someone who has never been the bored, was the decades-long strategic competition between these 2 empires for influence over Afghanistan, Iran, and Central Asia. Iran was the prize. Iran was also the victim. In 1813, the Treaty of Gulistan ended the First Russo-Persian War. Iran lost what is now Azerbaijan, Georgia, Dagestan, and other Caucasian territories, lands that had been Iranian for centuries. In 1828, the Treaty of Turkmenchay ended the Second War with further losses and, crucially, imposed extraterritorial rights on Russian citizens in Iran, meaning Russian nationals were beyond Iranian legal jurisdiction on Iranian soil. The British secured similar privileges through a series of agreements. Iran was not colonized in the formal sense. There was no British governor-general in Tehran, no Russian viceroy, but its sovereignty was systematically hollowed out. Its economic resources, oil, when it was discovered in 1,908 inches southwestern Iran, in massive quantities, the first major oil strike in the Middle East, were controlled by foreign interests. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, founded in 1909, was effectively a British imperial project that happened to be located on Iranian soil. The Iranians noticed. They had always been exceptionally good at noticing when they were being managed. The constitutional revolution of 1906 was Iran's first democratic uprising. Merchants, intellectuals, religious scholars, and ordinary citizens took to the streets demanding a constitution, a parliament, limitations on royal power. They got it briefly. The Constitution of 1906 established the Majlis, Iran's parliament, and represented a genuine popular achievement. But the constitutional order was fragile. The great powers did not want a strong, independent Iran, and the combination of internal divisions and external pressure kept it from taking hold. Iran, in the early 20th century, was a country with an ancient civilization and a modern problem. It was simultaneously being modernized from above and dismembered from outside. And the people experiencing both processes were the same people who had survived Mongols and Arabs and Macedonians and Timurids and were running out of patience. PHAs 5. The Century of Fire, Revolution, War, and the Republic. In 1921, a Persian Cossack officer named Reza Khan staged a coup in Tehran. By 1925, he had deposed the last Qajar Shah and declared himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, the first ruler of the Pahlavi dynasty, consciously named after an ancient Iranian language as a statement of nationalist intent. Reza Shah was a modernizer in the tradition of Ataturk, which is to say, a man who believed deeply that his country needed to be dragged into the 20th century regardless of whether the country agreed. He built roads and railways, he established the University of Tehran, he forced men to wear Western hats and banned the veil for women enforced by police, who removed it physically from women on the street. He suppressed tribal autonomy and built a centralized state. He changed the country's name in international usage from Persia to Iran in 1935 Iran, from Aryan, a deliberate linguistic assertion of pre-Islamic identity. His son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, came to power in 1941 when the British and Soviets simultaneously invaded Iran, occupying it to secure the supply route to Russia and removing Reza Shah, whom they suspected of pro-German sympathies. The young Mohammad Reza was, initially, a constitutional monarch in a complex political environment. Iran's politics in the late 1940s and early 1950s were genuinely plural, multiple parties, a functioning parliament, a vigorous press. The most significant political figure of this era was Mohammad Mossadegh, a nationalist politician of impeccable aristocratic credentials who had been opposing foreign interference in Iranian affairs since before the First World War. In 1951, as prime minister, he nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. He announced that the oil under Iranian soil belonged to Iran. The British were furious. The Americans were alarmed. In August of 1953, the CIA and British intelligence services organized a coup, Operation Ajax in American records, Operation Boot in British, ones that overthrew Mossadegh, arrested him, and restored full power to the Shah. The coup has been acknowledged by both governments. Mossadegh died under house arrest in 1967. He is still one of the most admired figures in Iranian history. The wound of 1,953 has never fully closed. The Shah, empowered and increasingly autocratic, launched his White Revolution in 1963, a series of reforms that included land redistribution, women's suffrage, and industrial development, intended to modernize Iran rapidly, without the messy process of democratic participation. Iran grew wealthier. The oil revenues of the 1970s made the government extraordinarily flush. Tehran acquired European boutiques and American fast food, and a nightlife that would not have been out of place in Paris. The Shah's secret police, SAVAK, created with CIA and Mossad assistance, monitored, arrested, tortured, and killed dissidents with quiet efficiency. The gap between the westernized elite of North Tehran and the religious, traditional, economically anxious population of everywhere else grew wider every year. And in Najaf, in Iraq, an exiled Iranian cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini was watching and recording and broadcasting and building. Khomeini was not the only oppositional voice in Iran. The communists organized, the nationalists organized, the Marxist-Islamist Mujahideen-e-Khalq organized, liberal intellectuals organized, but Khomeini was the one with the clearest message, the most uncompromising delivery, and the most powerful institutional base, the mosque network that covered every city and village in Iran, staffed by clergy who owed their education and their loyalty to the religious establishment that Khomeini represented. The revolution that consumed Iran in 1978 and 1979 was not organized from a single center. It was a spontaneous eruption at many points, simultaneously a genuinely popular uprising against a government that had lost its legitimacy in the eyes of an overwhelming majority of its people. Factory workers went on strike. Bazaris shuttered their shops. Soldiers refused to fire on crowds. The Shah's military, despite its American-supplied equipment and its billions in defense spending, found that it could not shoot its way out of a revolution in which half its own soldiers agreed with the demonstrators. On the 16th of January 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi boarded a plane at Mehrabad Airport in Tehran. He was, officially, going on vacation. He never came back. He died in exile in Egypt in 1980 of cancer. On the 1st of February 1979, Air France Flight 747, flight number 747, touched down at Mehrabad Airport carrying a 76-year-old cleric who had been in exile for 15 years. As Khamenei descended the stairs from the plane, a reporter asked him how he felt about returning to Iran after so long. His answer, delivered in a flat, uninflected tone that somehow captured everything about the man: nothing. What greeted him was everything. Estimates of the crowd that came out to see him range from 3 million to 5 million people. The streets of Tehran were a human ocean, stretching further than any camera could capture, generating a noise that the people present described afterward as a sound you felt in your chest rather than heard with your ears. This was not a political rally. This was an apocalyptic event, the return of something that millions of people believed was sacred, or at least transformative, or at least better than what they had. Within 10 days, the provisional government collapsed. The military declared neutrality. The revolution was complete. What followed was not what most of its participants had imagined. The liberals found themselves pushed out. The nationalists found themselves sidelined. The left found itself suppressed. Khamenei and the clerical establishment moved with speed and efficiency to consolidate control. A new constitution established the principle of Vilayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, which placed supreme authority not in a democratic vote or a hereditary monarchy, but in the hands of the senior religious scholar who the founding framework designated as supreme leader. Khamenei became that leader. The American hostage crisis, 444 days in which 52 American diplomats were held in their own embassy, cemented the rupture with the United States and gave the new government a rallying crisis around which all opposition could be marginalized as American-backed. The Iran-Iraq War, which began in September 1980 when Saddam Hussein, with covert American and explicit Arab support, invaded Iran, became the defining trauma of the new republic. 8 years, 500,000 dead, perhaps many more. Trench warfare in the marshes, chemical weapons used by Iraq with American intelligence assistance, child soldiers sent across minefields. The Islamic Republic channeled the war as a religious sacrifice, a Shia martyrdom narrative writ national. An entire generation of young Iranians grew up knowing nothing but the war. Khamenei died on the 3rd of June, 1989. The scenes of public mourning were extraordinary. Millions of people, a crowd so large and grief-stricken that the crowd crushed itself, crushing people against the coffin. It took hours for the body to be moved. He was succeeded by someone who was not, by traditional measures, his religious equal, but who would prove to be his political successor in every way that mattered. Ali Hosseini Khamenei was 50 years old when he became supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. He was not the most senior cleric in the country. Several ayatollahs outranked him in religious learning and traditional hierarchy. He was not the most charismatic figure in the revolution. Others had been more beloved, more widely followed. He had served as president for 8 years, 1981 to 1989. Competently but without brilliance. He was, by most measures, a second-tier figure who had ended up in the first position through a combination of availability, political calculation by the assembly of experts, and the fact that no one else could unite the factions. What he possessed, and what no one fully appreciated at the time, was patience and political instinct of an extraordinary depth. He began carefully, constructing his authority gradually, filling the institutions beneath the supreme leadership with loyalists, building a network of control that extended through the Revolutionary Guards, through the judiciary, through the state broadcasting network, through the mosques and seminaries that remained the neural network of Iranian social organization. He was not warm. He was not charismatic in the way Khomeini had been. He projected authority through austerity, through the image of a man who did not want power but exercised it because duty demanded it. Whether that image reflected reality, only he could know. The 1990s were years of cautious reconstruction under President Rafsanjani, an attempt to rebuild an economy devastated by the war and international isolation, to reopen Iran to foreign investment and trade, to lower the revolutionary temperature without abandoning the revolutionary framework. The economy partially recovered, the population grew, And a new generation was being born, a generation that had never known the Shah, that had grown up entirely within the Islamic Republic, that knew the revolution only as a founding mythology rather than a lived experience. This generation had questions. The reform presidency of Mohammad Khatami, elected in 1,997 inches, a surprise landslide that shocked the conservative establishment, represented the Islamic Republic's first genuine internal challenge, not from outside the system, but from within it. Khatami won on a platform of civil society, rule of law, and dialogue with the West. Students who had never voted before turned out in extraordinary numbers. Women who had spent their lives navigating the restrictions of the Islamic dress code voted for a man who seemed to understand that governance required something beyond enforcement. For 4 years, something different was possible. Press freedom expanded, student unions organized, cultural life opened up. And then the conservative establishment, through the judiciary, through the Guardian Council, through the Revolutionary Guards, through all the mechanisms that Khamenei controlled without ever publicly appearing to control them, pushed back. Newspapers were shut down. Student leaders were arrested. Laws were interpreted in ways that preserved the letter of constitutional reform while gutting its spirit. Khatami served 2 terms and left office with most of his reforms reversed or stalled. He had proven that the Islamic Republic could hold real elections. He had also proven that the elections did not finally determine who held power. The election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in 2005, a conservative populist who promised to put the oil money on every Iranian's dinner table and who spoke the revolutionary language with a fluency that the establishment found comfortable, marked the pendulum's swing back. Ahmadinejad was confrontational with the West, aggressive in his rhetoric, and deeply committed to the nuclear program that was becoming the defining international issue of Iran's relationship with the world. And in June 2009, Iran held an election that the world watched and that the Iranian establishment appeared to steal. The Green Movement, the massive popular uprising that followed the disputed presidential election results that gave Ahmadinejad a second term over his challenger, Mir Hossein Mousavi, was the largest internal challenge the Islamic Republic had faced since its founding. Millions of people filled the streets of Tehran and other cities, wearing green, carrying signs, chanting in Persian, "Where is my vote?" The images of Neda Agha Sultan, shot on a Tehran street by what the government described as provocateurs and the world described as government forces, became the face of the movement. A 26-year-old woman dying on a sidewalk, her eyes going still, the video spreading globally within hours in a way that 1,979 technology could not have managed. The Green Movement was crushed, systematically and thoroughly. Thousands were arrested, some were killed, some were tortured. The leaders Mousavi, Mehdi Karoubi were placed under house arrest that continues to this day. The streets were emptied. But the people who had been in those streets did not forget. They raised children. They kept thinking, and they passed something to the next generation, the knowledge that it was possible to stand in the streets and say, "This is wrong," even if it costs everything, even if it fails. The nuclear program remained the central instrument of the Islamic Republic's international identity through these decades, at once a genuine strategic project and a political tool for managing both external pressure and internal legitimacy. The program had begun under the Shah, was interrupted by the revolution, and resumed and expanded under the Islamic Republic in ways that convinced most outside observers that weaponization was at least a future option. Sanctions imposed by the United States, European Union, and United Nations squeezed the Iranian economy severely. Inflation, unemployment, currency collapse. Ordinary Iranians bore the economic cost of a political standoff between their government and the international community. The 2015 nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, negotiated under President Rouhani, briefly raised hopes that Iran might rejoin the international economic community. The United States withdrew from it in 2018 under President Trump, reimposing sanctions. The deal's subsequent deterioration became another wound in an already very long list of Iranian grievances about Western reliability. Then came Mahsa Amini. In September 2022, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman was arrested by the morality police in Tehran for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. She died in custody 3 days later. The government said it was a heart attack. The medical evidence suggested otherwise. Within days, protests had erupted across Iran, not just in Tehran, not just among the educated urban elite, but in cities and towns across the country, in provinces that had long been considered safe for the regime, among groups Kurdish, Baloch, Azerbaijani, Arab that rarely unified. The slogan of the uprising was Zan, Zendegi, Azadi, woman, life, freedom. Young women tore off their headscarves in public and burned them. Young men joined them. High school students walked out. The response of the Islamic Republic was violent. Security forces opened fire on crowds. Hundreds were killed. Thousands were arrested. But the protests persisted for months, longer than the Green Movement, broader in geographic scope, more heterogeneous in social composition. The Islamic Republic did not fall. But something shifted. The social compact, the implicit agreement between the government and a sufficient portion of the population to maintain stability, showed cracks that were difficult to paper over. The generation that took to the streets in 2022 had grown up entirely within the Islamic Republic, had never known any other system, and had decided, in significant numbers, that they did not want what the Islamic Republic was offering. The empty battlefield, seen from the air, looked like this. A country of 85 million people, median age 29, with one of the highest literacy rates and one of the highest university enrollment rates in the Middle East, living under a political system designed in 1979 for a different world, governed by men whose average age was 65, navigating between the demands of a revolutionary ideology and the realities of a 21st century economy and culture. The Revolutionary Guards, the parallel military structure that guards the revolution more than the territory, that controls significant portions of the Iranian economy, that answers to Khamenei before the elected government, represent one answer to the question of how power is maintained in a society that no longer fully believes in its own governing mythology. The poets, the filmmakers, the architects, the women who took off their headscarves on the street, they represent something else. The same impulse that kept Persian alive under Arab conquest. The same impulse that made Ferdowsi write 60,000 couplets when the easier choice was silence. The same impulse that has driven Iranian civilization forward, and sometimes underground, and sometimes sideways, for 5,000 years. Stand at Persepolis again. Not at dusk, this time at dawn, when the light comes in low and gold from the east and strikes the stone at an angle that makes every carved figure leap forward from its background. The delegations are still arriving. The Babylonians with their cloth, the Indians with their gold, the Ethiopians with their ivory, the Greeks, always the Greeks, slightly apart from the others, slightly self-conscious with their silver vessels. They have been arriving for 2,500 years. They will keep arriving. What did Iran give the world? Not as a rhetorical question, but as a genuine inventory, taken seriously. The Cyrus cylinder gave the world its first written declaration that conquered peoples have rights, that religion is not the business of conquerors, that displaced peoples deserve to return to their homes, that a ruler's authority carries obligations as well as powers. This was not inevitable. Assyria had a different theory. Egypt had a different theory. It was Cyrus Persian, Zoroastrian. A man whose moral framework came from an Iranian tradition who produced the formulation that we now recognize as foundational. The Achaemenid administrative state gave the world a template for governing diverse peoples across vast territories that was so effective it was essentially copied by every large empire that came after it. The satrap system, the royal road, the standardized weights and measures, the multilingual record-keeping, the principle of allowing subject peoples to maintain their own laws and religions within an imperial framework, these innovations were not obvious. They were Iranian inventions. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian faith that Darius and Xerxes and Cyrus all practiced, gave the world the theological framework that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all drew on and transformed. The cosmic struggle between good and evil, the concept of a final judgment, the resurrection of the dead, the figure of Satan as an independent adversary of God rather than merely an instrument of divine testing. These ideas entered the Western religious tradition through Jewish contact with Achaemenid Persia during the Babylonian exile. The world's three largest monotheistic religions carry Iranian DNA in their deepest theological structures. Persian poetry gave the world a literature of emotional and philosophical depth that has no parallel. Rumi's Masnavi, written in Persian in 13th century Anatolia, in a tradition shaped by centuries of Iranian literary culture, is the best-selling poetry book in the United States in most years of the 21st century. Rumi died in 1273. He is more widely read today than he was in his own lifetime. The poetry outlasted every empire. It outlasted every ideology. It crossed every border. And then, there is the pattern itself, the thing that 5,000 years of Iranian history demonstrates, with a consistency that becomes almost mathematical. Iran has been conquered, completely and comprehensively, at least 4 times, by forces that appeared, at the moment of conquest, to be irresistible and permanent. The Macedonians, the Arab Muslims, the Mongols, the second Mongol wave under Timur. Each time, Iranian civilization went underground, kept the language alive, kept the poetry circulating, kept the intellectual and spiritual traditions moving, and then, with varying degrees of speed and gentleness, absorbed the conquerors. The Macedonians became Persian in everything but name within a generation. The Mongol Ilkhans converted to Islam, commissioned Persian manuscripts, and governed through Persian administrative structures. Timur's descendants, the Timurids, produced some of the most exquisite examples of Persian miniature painting in history. This is not a coincidence. This is a civilizational strategy, practiced across 50 centuries, with a consistency that suggests it is not strategy at all, but instinct, the deep, unconscious response of a culture that has learned to outlast everything. You cannot kill a civilization that knows how to wait. You cannot erase a tradition that has memorized itself. You cannot conquer a people whose most powerful weapon is a poem. The Islamic Republic of Iran is, in this long view, not an endpoint but a chapter. A long chapter, certainly 45 years at the time of this writing, longer than any of the post-Mongol successor states, longer than the Pahlavi dynasty itself. But a chapter in a book that began before writing existed, that has survived conquests and catastrophes that looked, at the time, like permanent endings. The 70-year-old clergymen who run the Islamic Republic and the 20-year-old women who burn their headscarves in the streets in 2022 are both, in their different ways, deeply Iranian. They are arguing about what Iran should be. That argument has been ongoing since Cyrus first declared that the conquered have rights. It was ongoing when Ferdowsi wrote 60,000 couplets, rather than accept the erasure of Iranian memory. It was ongoing when the constitutional revolutionaries of 1906 demanded a parliament from a Qajar king who had never imagined being asked. It will be ongoing long after the current argument is resolved in whatever direction, through whatever means. Iran is not a state that happens to have a long history. Iran is a long history that happens to currently contain a state. The fire at Yazd still burns. The Zoroastrian sacred flame at the Atashbehram temple in central Iran has been burning continuously since approximately 470 CE, 1500 years. It survived the Arab conquest. It survived the Mongols. It survived Tamerlane. It survived the Islamic Revolution. Every few years, it is moved carefully, reverently, by the small remaining Zoroastrian community of Iran to a new vessel, a new location, but never extinguished. Never allowed to go out. The keepers of that fire are the descendants of the people who built Persepolis. They speak the oldest surviving form of the Iranian language. They practice a religion that shaped 3 of the world's great faiths without receiving credit for it. They are a tiny community, perhaps 100,000 people in Iran, and they maintain their flame. In a country that has been everything, survived everything, transformed everything that tried to transform it, there is something fitting about that image. A fire that has no memory of every hand that fed it, no knowledge of every storm that tried to extinguish it, no understanding of the 5,000 years of human turbulence through which it has burned. Just burning. Just burning. Centuries from now, when whoever comes after us looks back at this long, strange, brutal, the beautiful story, they will find the same thing that every conqueror found when they rode onto this plateau expecting to erase it. The wind, the stone, the fire, and Iran, still here.